Well, there had been quite a build-up to next year's Republic Day with intense speculation that perhaps the chief guest would be none other than President Donald Trump of the United States. But it turns out that President Trump has declined India's invitation. In fact, NDTV has learned that he said no several weeks earlier, citing a very quote-unquote crowded agenda in January, which among other things also includes the annual State of the Union address. Now, this does raise questions about why then India leaked or to some sections of the media the very fact that he had been invited in the first place. Normally, foreign dignitaries are invited for Republic Day once there is a confirmation in place. That's only when the formal invite goes. India then went on to say that this was a generic invitation. It wasn't specific to a particular date. However, the White House then went on record to say that it was an invitation for Republic Day, that he was considering it, and now we know that he has declined. Ties between India and the US have been a bit strained in recent months, whether it has been over tariffs, whether it has been over oil imports from Iran, India's defense purchases from Russia. So should India be looking at this as a snub from the US president? And who then will India's Republic Day guest actually be? We have Ambassador K.C. Singh joining us this evening, also Dhruv Jaishankar, Fellow for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Manish Tiwari still with us, will be joined by Sadanand Dhume from Washington, and Vivek Reddy of the BJP joining us as well. Ambassador Singh, is this how India should look at it, as a snub? Do you think it's linked to some of the tensions we've been seeing in the India-US relationship, or are some people making too much of this?
Look, there are two dimensions. Let's look at the protocol element and the strategic element. And you can't have the two, you can't mix them up and clash with each other. Now, protocol-wise, there's nothing wrong if a foreign dignitary is invited and the dignitary has other commitments and tells you he cannot make it. That's all right. It has happened in the past. We've had last-minute changes, etc., where we've had something arose. But in this case, the leaks came from within the government, and they started a long time ago. Now, at that stage, to start speculation before another country has accepted is always dangerous. And secondly, President Trump himself is not a terribly, safe guest to have. He generally has been known to create problems and create problems for the hosts. And why would BJP want that just 2 or 3 months before the Lok Sabha election? And again, most high-level visitors may not have wanted to come to India just before the elections, which are likely to be highly contentious. They don't know which way they're going to go. And then comes the strategic element. If we've been rebalancing relations with America by reaching out to China, the Wuhan meeting, reaching out to Russia, buying the S-400 system where Trump was not very happy about it, saying we'll have to continue to buy Iranian oil, etc. Now, if you knew you're rebalancing, this is a transactional president. He goes to Saudi Arabia when his son-in-law has already tied up the defense deals. He will make a visit if he thinks there is something to be gained. But if he doesn't sniff any money or any transaction, then we should have expected that if we are rebalancing, then he may not come. So you couldn't be in the process of rebalancing and at the same time trying to invite him. So I think there's a problem there.
Sadanand, how do you see this development? I noticed on Twitter you were taking some bets with other journalists about whether or not Donald Trump would come to India. Have you won or lost that bet, firstly?
I've won that bet, and I'm owed a drink at the Trump Hotel in Washington, which I'm looking forward to. Look, I think the whole thing hinges in a way on whether this story was leaked by the government or whether it was just ferreted out by an enterprising reporter. I agree with Ambassador Singh that there's nothing wrong with reaching out to Trump. I also think that actually politically it would have been quite a coup for Modi heading into the national general election, to have the world's most powerful man beside him, to project himself as having arrived on the global stage and brought India with him and so on. So I can see the logic of it. If the government indeed was responsible for leaking this news, then of course it's extremely ham-handed, because it seemed quite clear to me from the start, which is why I won this bet, that the odds of Trump accepting this invitation were very slim. I don't think this is for strategic reasons necessarily. It's just that he's notoriously not a very good traveler. He is not a fan of traveling long distances. He has a pretty short attention span, and I imagine that the idea of him sitting through 3.5 hours of, floats from the Department of Ayush and the cultural treasures of Orissa or whatever, it always sort of, struck me as being a stretch. So I'm not surprised. I agree that it's somewhat embarrassing for the government, but I think that in terms of the analysis we're seeing, we're connecting the dots a little bit too explicitly. I don't think that this little kerfuffle about Republic Day is something that is reflective of the broader US-India relationship, which has some hiccups, but on the whole is doing pretty okay.
I think you're right, but I think what people also often, and the reason why so much is read into it is because you did have a US president who came not once but twice to Republic Day in the last few years, and perhaps people sort of contrast Donald Trump's relationship with India with the relationship President Obama had with India. But having said that, then, Dhruv Jaishankar, do you think it was actually even a good idea to even ask Donald Trump to come, notwithstanding what Sadanand Dhume is saying, simply because we did have President Obama coming twice in the last 5 years? So would it have been more prudent anyway to focus on another country? And now, frankly, whoever you do call knows that they're the second choice. I mean, it's really, really awkward for India.
I think we're conflating three different issues here, and I largely would agree with Sadanand's assessment. One, is it okay to invite the US president? I think it's an important relationship for India, arguably the most important relationship for India, so there's no harm in inviting him. He's a new president, he's very different from Obama, so it makes sense to invite him again, even though President Obama had attended in 2015. So I think that issue is quite clear. He again has decided not to come. The second issue, I think, is the protocol behind it, and I think Ambassador K.C. Singh did discuss that in some detail. I think the contrast here can be drawn with the 2015 visit of President Obama, when it was not known to anybody until the two sides, the two governments, the White House included, tweeted the acceptance quite publicly. So it was very closely held, there were no leaks, and I think the contrast can be seen, and that has obviously affected the outcome, or it may have affected the outcome. Finally, I think the issue on India-US relations, I would agree with Sadanand. I think there have been some differences on Iran, on Russia, on trade issues. But overall, I mean, as we saw with the 2+2 meeting that took place recently, there's a lot more strategic convergence than there was in the past, a lot more content in the relationship, and relatively speaking, India has not done too badly out of Trump so far. So all of that told, I wouldn't look at it necessarily as a snub.
Well, Manish Tiwari, do you agree, or are some people reading too much into this? No.
Well, maybe you need to understand that the United States of America is going through a fundamental reset in its foreign policy. President Trump seems to be completely hell-bent on dismantling the global order which came into existence post the end of the Second World War. And unfortunately, India is not among his priorities. I happened to be in Washington, D.C. on the day this particular news made it to the Indian media that the government of India had invited President Trump to be the chief guest at the Republic Day parade. And when we started talking to people within the administration, some within the White House itself, the general refrain was that for President Trump to go to India, there has to be a forward movement on a large number of issues, especially on trade. President Trump has been beating down very hard on the entire trade issue. In September, you had the trade talks being called off almost at the last moment when the U.S. point person did not travel to India. Subsequently, they did take place. So I do not think that there is enough traction in the Indo-US relationship for President Trump to actually come and invest energy in it. And moreover, things have kind of cooled off between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi after Manila, because there's something which did happen in Manila which kind of even impelled Prime Minister Narendra Modi to go in for a reset. He traveled to Wuhan, he traveled to Sochi, he was trying to sort of hedge his bets. So under those circumstances, it is not surprising. Prime Minister Modi wanted President Trump to be here more as an electoral prize on the 26th of January, just ahead of the 2019 elections. And I don't think the Americans are anybody's fools. They didn't want to be played in India's domestic political battle, A. And number two, I don't think there was enough happening in the Indo-US relationship for President Trump to make the trip. And finally,
All right,
let's
so
not
you
forget,
clearly don't agree with
let's-
Sadanand and
let's-
Dhruv's assessment then that the relationship is actually doing all right despite all this. But Vivek Reddy, is part of the problem also the political rhetoric in which foreign policy has got trapped in now? You know, every single sort of meeting the PM has, every summit meeting, everything is sort of, you know, politically played up in such a way. And we now know that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump haven't had a conversation, even on the phone, for several months. There may or may not be a meeting on the sidelines of the G20 next month. That's still up in the air. So is part of the problem that we also tend to overplay the outcomes of these, bilateral meetings?
Well, I think, Nidhi, the first thing is the reason why Mr. Trump refused was purely domestic and due to his other pressing engagements. So that is the chief cause for his declining the invitation. Perhaps going by what Mr. Sadanand Dhume said, none of this has had any impact on the Indo-US relationship, which is on a very, very strong platform, on a very strong footing. I mean, given the fact that there are so many expats in America, and given the fact that India and US are tied up since several years in a deep bond and in deep relationship, I don't think this small incident will have anything or create any impact to undo this long-term relationship that we have with America, which has grown and strengthened over the past perhaps past 5 years, more than in any other regime. So therefore, we are on a strong footing there. Regarding other issues,
what about the India-US nuclear deal? I think you can step aside from politics for a moment, at least give Dr. Manmohan Singh credit for the India-US relationship also.
Well, during Bush and Manmohan Singh's regime, that was when they finally thrashed out a deal, but that was not the be-all and end-all. It began with Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee government's inclination to start off nuclear testing. So therefore, these beginnings are also in BJP government. But the larger issue is this: whether it is the transaction with Iran economically to buy fuel at Indian rupee with the Indian rupees, or whether it is the transactions with Russia, India has always stood out as a very strong nation that will not compromise its interests, either in defense or in the economy. So here we see that despite the relations with all countries, India is still going strong based on its typical non-involvement with other nations. So therefore, it's a very strong position that Mr. Modi has lodged India in.